However, I feel it's important to perhaps reiterate that before we discuss our next topic of validity. So just briefly, and this will also allow you to have a recording of my explanation of each of the different types of reliability, which you can repeat, so you can listen, repeat, and that will help you as you're studying. So reliability generally has to do with the extent to which we're seeing consistency in the scores across the items that we have included in our measure or scale. So reliability is focused on consistency. If I say I'm extroverted and you give me a scale that has 10 questions measuring my level of extroversion, my score on those 10 items should be consistent. That's one way we look at reliability, and that is called internal consistency reliability. So as I had illustrated in class on Monday, when we're looking at internal consistency reliability, we're looking to see the association or the relationship between the items that are included in a single measure. To examine our internal consistency reliability, we use a statistics called the Cronbach's alpha, and that would be your measure of internal consistency, and that can range from 0 to 1. The next form of reliability is our test-retest reliability, and that has to do with time. So that's more temporal in nature. So if we're looking at, we would do this if we're looking to see how reliable or how consistent scores are from one time point to another time point. So I give you a measure of extroversion on day 1 in the semester, and at the end of the semester, I also measure your level of extroversion. Test-retest reliability would be where we're seeing consistency between those two scores, the score from time 1 and the score from time 2. Test-retest. And to measure that, we look at the correlation between those two time points. So I try to correlate your score on the time 1 measure with your score on the time 2 measure, and if that correlation is high, then that means I am seeing test-retest reliability. And then finally, we have our alternative form or equivalent form reliability. And this is where we're looking at the reliability or the consistency or the correlation between two versions of the same measure. So for example, your next exam, I'm not doing this, but if I were to create two different forms of the exam, a form A and a form B, so similar questions about the same content, and I gave you those two forms of the measure, I would look to see if scores are consistent between form 1 and form 2. So that would be your alternative form reliability. So we did this activity in class on Monday, but I've kept it in the slides now because I've removed the other alternatives, and so in the next 4 slides I won't be doing a voiceover for those. I just included those slides so you can see what the answers are for each of those options. I think this will help you as you're studying. It will help to differentiate between the different types of reliability that we just discussed. So again, we went over these in class, but I've repeated the next 4 slides here. Okay, so we did discuss this slide in class. Monday. But again, so you have something to listen to as you're studying, and I know these concepts might be a bit difficult to distinguish between at times. I'm adding this recording or revisiting rather these concepts so that you have something you can listen to as you're studying, and I'll incorporate some examples as I go through them that will hopefully help you. I also noticed an arrow at the bottom of the slide from Monday, so I've corrected that and I'll point that out when I get there. So validity generally has to do with the extent to which our measures are accurate. So if I say I'm measuring a concept or a construct, the scale that I develop should accurately measure that thing and not something else, and not something random, right? It should be really measuring that thing I set out to be measuring. So if I'm measuring extroversion and I develop a scale of extroversion, my scale should capture extroversion. The first way we can examine validity is what we call face validity. And this is when generally on the surface or on the face of it, our scale looks like it's measuring what it's intended to measure. So the examples that we discussed, or the example rather, that we discussed in class was this idea of being asked interview questions that didn't seem relevant. And so I brought up the example of my friend who shared with me that she went to do a job interview and she was asked about whether or not she had a Barbie collection. I think I mentioned that in class. But to her, that didn't seem relevant. So on the face of it, it didn't seem as if that measure was truly capturing or related to the job at all. So that's face validity. So on the surface of it, it doesn't look like it's measuring what it's intended to measure, or it looks like it's measuring what it intends to measure. That's where we do see face validity. The other type or way we can look at validity is called content validity. And essentially, this is where the content or what's in our scale reflects the actual domain that it's supposed to reflect. So the range of the material that's included in our measure truly reflects the target variable or the target, that thing it's supposed to be measuring. So we can use the example of your exam that's coming up. So if I say your exam will cover one topic from chapter 4, then chapter 5, 6, and 7, when I write the exam questions, I should be including questions from those chapters. If I don't include questions from each of those chapters, then my exam wouldn't be content valid. It wouldn't be measuring or assessing the topics that are covered in those chapters. So if I leave one chapter out, for example, then my exam would lack content validity. So it has to do with the items really reflecting the subdomains that it should reflect in a test. We also talked about the example in class of assessing how good a professor is. We might look at things like their level of, or how organized they are, how clearly they explain things, how they grade our assignments, how friendly they are or available during office hours or outside of class time. And so if you decide that those are the 5 or 6 dimensions that you're measuring, then your test should cover all 5 of those dimensions. Our third way to look at validity is what we call construct validity. And construct validity is the extent to which our scale actually measures the desired construct. So someone had asked in class what the difference was between content and construct. So content has to do with the actual content of the test, so what's really represented in the test. And construct is more broad. So construct has to do with the extent to which my scale or my measure is actually capturing that thing it's supposed to be measuring from a higher level. And so there are 2 ways we typically look at this. One is called convergent validity, and the other is discriminant validity. With convergent validity, we look at the degree to which the measure or measure corresponds to measures of other theoretically related variables. What that means is, if I'm measuring a concept or a construct, let's say extroversion, then my measure should correlate to anything that is theoretically related to extroversion, right? So my scores, the scores on my scale of extroversion should be similar to the scores on a measure that is of a construct or concept that's theoretically related to extroversion. So some might think that being more extroverts are more friendly. So your scale on extroversion in that case should be similar to your scale on your measure, your scores on a measure of friendliness. And then discriminant validity, this is where I noticed the arrow from the previous slides. Okay, so we did discuss this slide in class Monday. So your scale on extroversion in that case should be similar to your scale on your measure, your scores on a measure of friendliness. And then discriminant validity, this is where I noticed the arrow from the previous slides. So please note the difference in the definition here, or the note that I have on the slide here. Discriminant validity has to do with the extent to which a measure does not correspond to measures of unrelated variables. So it's the opposite of convergent validity. So discriminant validity is where my measure of extroversion is not corresponding to things that are unrelated to extroversion. So convergent is where we're corresponding with things that are similar to extroversion, and discriminant is where we're not corresponding with things that are unrelated. So if we identify a measure or a construct that should not be related to how extroverted people are, then the scores on extroversion should not correspond or should not be similar to my score on this other thing that's not related to extroversion. Okay? Criterion-related validity is another way in which, or another method that we can use to assess the accuracy or the validity of a measure or scale. And criterion-related validity is defined as the extent to which a measurement or scale relates to a particular outcome or behavior. So a criterion is an outcome, and when we see or when we have criterion-related validity, we're seeing a relationship between the construct we are measuring and some type of outcome. So as an IO psychologist, naturally, I kind of will default to an IO psychology example here. But say I give you a test as a potential employer, and that test is implemented during your job application process, right? So I give you this test that is supposed to give me some information about how well you would do on the job. How well you would do on the job would be my outcome. So the idea is that that test that I give to you is supposed to be predicting how well you do on the job, that being the outcome, right? So criterion-related validity would be where I see a correlation or some type of relationship between how well you do on the test and how well you do on the job, right? There are two ways, again, to examine this, and one is concurrent validity. This is the extent to which the measurement corresponds to an outcome. And this has to do with, or the concurrent related validity relates to there being a relationship if both measures are implemented or given at the same time. So going back to my test, say I want to look, so before I give you the test as the applicant, I go to all my employees to kind of pilot test my test. And so I would give the test to people who are currently working at the organization, and then go to their supervisors on the same day, perhaps, and get some information about how well they're doing on the job. So in that sense, or in that example, that would be, or concurrent validity, because I am looking at criterion-related validity. So this is a type of criterion-related validity or criterion validity. But in this case, I'm giving you the test and looking at the outcome at the same time. And so that will be the difference between concurrent related validity or concurrent validity and predictive validity. When we're looking at predictive validity, I change the time. So I might give you the test on day 1, and then I accept you, give you the job, and then I observe you for 3 months to see how well you do, and then I look to see if there's a correlation between how well you did while you were in the application process and how well you're doing after 3 months, your initial 3 months at the organization. So there's a time 1, time 2 component here, so there's a temporal difference, and so that would be more predictive validity. On the next slide, I have an example to kind of help to illustrate the difference between the two. Okay, so here we can see that illustration of that should help with differentiating between concurrent validity and predictive validity. So we are doing an assessment of a predictor. That would be the top box here in this image. And then at the bottom, we have assessment of the criterion. Criterion would be the outcome, so job performance, how well you actually do on the job, for example. So with concurrent related validity, at time 1, I measure both the predictor and the criterion. You can see that to the left of the slide. That would be concurrent because both are being measured on the same day or at the same time point. And predictive validity would be where we're measuring or assessing our predictor at time 1, and then at a later time, we're measuring our criterion. So that's predictive validity. So the difference between the two is time. When we do both the predictor and the criterion at the same time, that's concurrent. And when we do the predictor before and then the criterion after, when we have some temporal delay or some delay in time, then that's more predictive validity. But both of these are criterion validity, just different types. Okay, so we've spent some time talking about some issues related to scale development on the previous slide. So reliability, having to do with how consistent our scale is, the scores that we assess using the scores that we get using a particular scale, and then validity, which has to do with how accurate our scores are. And those are factors or issues that are relevant to the development of scales or the development of measures. So when we met on Monday, we talked about some issues related to the wording of items, right? But the reliability and the validity aspect are also very important as we develop our skills. And so for the purposes of this class, and that's pretty much the extent to which we will explore those scale development issues. But for your exam, it's really important that you understand the difference between the different types of reliability and the different ways that we can assess validity. All right, so now let's transition to the idea of tests and hypothesis and the different types of hypothesis that we can have. So again, as a reminder, we are in the chapter that's looking at correlational research. And with correlational research, we're looking to see the association between two variables. Before we do our research, we do generate some hypotheses. And our hypotheses can either be non-directional or they can be directional in nature. So a non-directional hypothesis would be where we expect that, where we make some sort of non-specific predictions about how two variables might be related. So I might say, as we see on the slide, someone is going to win this game, right? In that example or in that statement, I'm making a hypothesis, but I'm not specifying or I'm not very specific in terms of predicting who is going to win. I'm just saying someone is going to win. In terms of psychology research, I might say a non-specific hypothesis would be where I say there is going to be an association between X and Y. Right? There is going to be an association between how extroverted someone is and how well they perform in teams. Or there is going to be an association between how much someone speaks up and how good they will be at the job of as a lead how well they would be in a leadership role. Right, so you're making a hypothesis, but you're not specifying what that relationship would look like. You're just suggesting that there will be a relationship, there will be an effect, something will happen. Or directional hypothesis, however, are more specific, right? So in this situation, when we use a directional hypothesis, we are making specific predictions about what will happen. So rather than saying someone is going to win this game, we would say my team is going to win this game, which is probably something we always say. Or I might say there's going to be a positive relationship between how extroverted someone is and how well they do perform in teams. Right? When I say it's a positive relationship, it means that the more extroverted someone is, the better they will do in teams. So both of those two variables are increasing, right? The association is positive in that case. Or I might specify a negative association where I say as one thing increases, something else would decrease. In our chapter on the psychologist toolbox, we were first introduced to different sampling strategies. So sampling is where we select from or subset, the subset of a population to determine or to identify people to test or to evaluate or to implement or use our measures on when we're doing research. So when we do our research, we're typically hoping to make generalizations to a wider population, but realistically, we need instead to pull from a sample, so a smaller subset from our population. That's called our sample. Before we go out and select those folks, we need to have a sampling plan. And so in the chapter on the psychologist toolbox, there was a section on the fact that we have this what's called probability sampling versus non-probability sampling. And so we discussed a few examples of both of those. And so in this chapter, we revisit the different types of probability sampling. And the first here is our simple random sampling. And this is where we sample randomly rather from everyone in our sample. So if I say I'm doing research to understand a wider population, but I'm using the subset from the psychology pool, I would randomly sample from that smaller group that represents the population. And so this is where we randomly select from everyone within the population for our sample. So that's simple random sampling. Stratified random sampling is where we randomly sample from subpopulations or strata. So on the slide here, say we are interested in trying to ensure that we have an equal number or adequate representation of males and females in our sample. What we could do is we could divide our population into these strata or subgroups. So we have males and females, and then we randomly sample from the males and randomly sample from the females. So we're still randomly sampling, but that allows or tries to ensure that we have adequate representation from these subpopulations. And so you would do that depending on your research questions. If you're trying to look at people in different undergraduate students at Wayne State, you would perhaps want to adequately represent the different majors or disciplines that people are students in. And so what you could do is you could get a list of all the psych majors, a list of all the biology majors, and so forth and so on, and then you randomly sample from each of those subgroups to ensure that you have adequate representations from each subpopulation. And then finally, we have our area probability sampling, which is similar to stratified sampling. However, we're developing these subgroups based on people's location. So rather than randomly sampling from different majors, you could randomly sample from different dorms. So in this example, Smith Hall versus Allen Hall, and then you randomly sample. Or if you are, you could do something, if you want to get a sample of people in the Midwest, you could use area probability sampling to make sure that you're getting a sample from each state that is represented in the Midwest region. So error probability sampling has to do with geographical areas, and stratified random sampling just generally relates to different subpopulations, but isn't geographic in nature. Okay, so for the next, the remaining slides, I'm going to briefly walk through this example from the text. So as we know, in this text, they try to provide an example in each chapter to help with your understanding of the different methods, right? And so in this chapter on correlational research, they're looking at the association between students' sense of self and their interest in joining a fraternity or sorority, right? So we're looking to see, or they described research looking at this association between sense of self and interest in fraternity. So that was the question in this chapter. So as with pretty much all our methods, we want to start by first defining our concepts and then exploring the literature to see what has already been done that will help to inform the predictions that we'll make, the specific questions that we might ask in our research. And so we would want to review the literature looking at differences between Greek and non-Greek college students, or differences between students who tend to be more interested in joining fraternities and sororities and students who are not as interested. So by reviewing the literature, we would have a better understanding of what research had already been done before or research question, or before or research rather. And again, or here, we would go to databases like Psych info, we would determine our search terms, and we would review the literature there, identify a subset of articles. There are a few mentioned in the text that were used or that could be used that are related to this topic. Similarly, we'd want to take a look at research on self-concept. So what does that mean? What have other researchers looked at as it relates to self-concept? What do we know about self-concept? So typical questions like that. So question around self-concept that would help to kind of narrow that search so that you're getting articles that are more tightly related to what you're interested in looking at. So here again, as with every method, we want to review our literature before we start our research and generate our research questions. So when we get to thinking about our design in correlational research, as we discussed in the last class, typically we'll use survey measures to assess our variables. And so in this example, that was what they did. So they used 2 survey measures as well as a behavioral measure. For the survey measure, a scale of self-concept clarity was used, and this was an already existing scale. They also used a scale to measure attitudes toward Greek organizations, which was something they needed to create. Now, if you have a research question and you go to the literature to look to see what others have already, what kind of research has already been done, while you're searching, you will come across, or you very likely will come across studies that have measured the concept that you're measuring. And so typically what you can do is you can use the same scale or measure that those studies have used. The benefit of doing this is that typically those scales would have already been validated. So they would have been a scale validation effort where the researchers ensure that the scale was reliable and valid. So really consistently measuring what it says it's measuring and accurately measuring what it says it's measuring. And so when we use those scales that have already been used, that takes care of issues like that. So we know we're using good scales. However, there are times when you might need to develop your own scale. So say you're looking at something like attitudes toward Greek organization and no one has ever measured or studied that before. Then in those situations, you may need to develop your own scale. So what that means is that you will have to make effort to ensure that your scale is reliable and that your scale is valid. Because using unreliable or invalid scales will significantly affect our ability to detect effects. So you would need to go through a scale development process before you actually do the study. So it does require a bit more time if you have to create your own measure. But at the same time, the advantage or the flip of that is that you would have created a measure that fits your needs, your research needs. So there's that. But there tends to be a delay or might require some time if you need to develop a new scale. And here they use the behavioral measure of Greek interest. So rather than asking people, they used observed behaviors. Once you have your measures in place, so your survey measures, your behavioral measures, where you're coding for people's behaviors as it relates to Greek organization or Greek interest in Greek organizations, then you go through the process of actually collecting your research. So you finalize your surveys or your measures, you select your sample using the sampling technique that you've that best suits your needs, and then you administer your surveys. It's important to consider the order in which you administer your surveys. And that is important because we do not want for our participants, for the order in which we administer the survey to affect people's responses. So many times when people are taking survey, they'll either consciously or not, make these predictions about what it is you're trying to study or what it is you're trying to understand about them. And so if you give them one measure first, chances are their responses on that measure might affect their responses on the other measure. So it's very important to think about the order that we give surveys and the effect that that could potentially have on our participants. So the two surveys in this study were the self-concept clarity scale and the attitudes toward Greek organization. So now that you've collected your data, what are the tasks that you need to do during your data analysis? So as a reminder, this is correlational research. Once you've developed your surveys, you've gone out, you've given people your surveys to complete, what you do next is really critical in the correlational design. So I give you a number of surveys. I then want to create participants' overall score for each of the measures in my survey. So I have 3 sets of data, one for the self-concept scale, one for the attitude toward Greek organization scale, and one related to people's interest in Greek organizations. As we talked about in class on Monday, when we're doing a scale, we don't include just one item, right? Because we want to ensure that people are consistent in their responses and that we're really capturing the full domain of each construct. So we typically include multiple items. So we would need to first, before we can do anything with the data, we need to calculate people's overall score on each of these. And we can calculate that by looking at the average. So say, for example, the self-concept scale had 10 items. I would take the average for that, or I could sum that, so take the sum. And so you want to calculate scores for each of these measures for each participant. You also want to take a look at the internal consistency of the scales that you've used. So the 2 surveys that you used, you want to look to make sure that they are reliable. And internal consistency, we talked about Cronbach's alpha. That's how we would calculate that. And Cronbach's alpha looks at the correlation between the items on the scale to look to see or to determine if they're consistent. So we do that. And then we want to summarize the measure for each scale. So we summarize the measure for each person. We also want to summarize the measures for each scale. So what's the average on the self-concept clarity scale? What's the average on the attitude toward Greek organization scale? And then we go about testing or hypothesis. In terms of the key feature of our design, this is correlational in nature. And in terms of statistics, we'll use three main statistics here. We will use our descriptive statistics, which are our means and standard deviations. So our means simply refer to the average. So what is the average score on each of these scales? And the standard deviation is another important statistic, and that tells us how much people's scores are deviating from the mean. So we have this mean or this average score. The standard deviation tells us what the difference is in terms of people's individual scores from the average or the mean. So that will give you a spread of how the scores or the range of the scores from the mean generally. And then finally, we look at the correlation of the measures. This will be a bit more complicated, and I'll talk about this a bit on a slide coming up. But the correlation would be our main statistic that helps us to determine whether there is an association between people's self-concept and their attitude toward Greek organizations. So we looked at a slide like this when we discussed observational research. And this, again, as a reminder, is what our data would look like in SPSS. And SPSS is the software that we use to analyze our data typically. You will get a chance to get more exposure to this when you take statistics, but just so you have an idea of what the data would look like. So in what's on the screen, it shows us SS1, SS2, SS3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And those would be the items related to self-concept clarity. So in this situation, we have 12 items or 12 questions that are measuring self-concept clarity. And so what's going across, those are the 12 items, and what's going down, those are each person. So in this example, it's just showing the scores for 9 people. For those 12 items, and then it has at the end there that one Greek item, but it continues to represent all the the Greek organization interest scores. But this would be what your data would look like. So previously I was talking about how we would want to summarize the data. So you'd want to summarize the data for each participant to look at their average for all 12 of those self-concept clarity items, and then you get that average for each person, and then you can get an overall average across your population of people's self-concept clarity score. Okay, so this is a pretty important slide, and this is where we're talking about correlation, as in the statistic correlation. This is the statistic that we use to determine if there's an association between our two variables. So between your self-concept clarity and your interest in Greek organizations. For example, you don't have to worry about well, for the purposes of this class, you won't be doing correlation analysis or calculating a correlation or anything like that. That will happen when you get to stats. That's when you'd learn a lot more about correlation. So for the purposes of this class, I'm just interested in you having a conceptual understanding of what a correlation is. So we're not doing any math here. We just need to understand what this correlation thing is. And so this is the statistic that helps us to determine if there is a relationship or an association between our two variables or not. All right, so what you'll see in this image is the symbol. So the R, that's what represents your correlation. So the R means correlation. That's a symbol for correlation. Equals plus or minus. The plus or minus tells us what direction the effect is. If we have a plus or a positive sign with our correlation, that means we are having or we're seeing a positive correlation. With a positive correlation, both variables are moving in the same direction. What I mean by that is, as one is increasing, the other is also increasing. So as your self-concept increases, your interest in joining a Greek organization is also increasing. That would be where we're seeing a positive direction or a positive correlation. Okay, and so this slide and the next 4 coming up, provide an example of how you would write up your method in APA style when you're actually doing your research. So the APA style is pretty strict in terms of what information we should include, how we should format our information. This is something that your TA will speak to you a bit more about in the lab. But when you're writing up your method, one of the first topics is your participants. So in this section, you want to describe who your participants are. You want to state how many participants you used, give some demographic information about your participants, if possible. And then you want to explain if you provided any incentives or to your participants as you were doing the study. And this description of your participant is important for a number of reasons, but it provides context to those who are reading your study. So because your conclusions will be so important, it's necessary that people who are reading your research understand who the data came from. So in this case, these are all first-year students. The majority of them were female. Those are things that are generally pretty important for your readers to know. The majority of them were white, non-Hispanic, and so that's the kind of information that the APA will require that you include in your write-up in your method section. Another section in your method would be a description of your measures. And so on this slide, we're seeing just a sample description of one of the measures that was used. So they're describing the self-concept clarity scale here. You want to say what the scale is measuring. You want to describe how many items are included in the scale. You want to give a sample or a couple sample items. You want to tell the readers what the scale was the 1 to 5 scale, was the 1 to 7 scale. In this case, it was 1 to 5, with 1 being strongly disagree and 5 being strongly agree. And you also want to report the reliability of the scale, which is very important. Typically, within research, we have a cutoff of 0.70. So you're generally encouraged or required not to use a scale that has a reliability less than 0.7. So you want to ensure that you're reporting the Cronbach's alpha, which is the statistics we use to communicate internal reliability or internal consistency. So you want to be sure to include that information in the description of your measure per the APA requirements. The next 2 slides provide an example of how you write up your procedure, which is the 3rd section in your method section. And this is really important. When I was in school, I was told that your procedure should be so detailed that someone should be able to pick your procedure up and repeat your study. And so what that means is that when you're writing up your procedures, you need to use a chronological order. So you need to describe exactly what was done or what your participants experienced from the moment you began interacting with them to the moment you stopped. So you want to ensure that your procedures are outlining exactly what you did so that people who are interested in replicating your study will be able to. And you want to provide as much details as possible. So the next 2 slides are, again, providing just an example of what the procedure section would look like. And the examples are specific to the research question that's covered in this chapter on self-concept and Greek organization, attitudes toward Greek organizations. Okay, and so this slide jumps into providing you with an example of the results write-up in APA style. So here you'll see that the authors are reporting the mean, so the average for each scale, as well as the standard deviation for each of the scales that they included. And they also describe or provide information on the correlations that they found. So the first paragraphs is descriptive statistics. You're providing information on the means for each scale, the standard deviation. And in the second paragraph, they're describing the correlation. So there was a statistically significant positive relation between one's self-concept clarity and one's attitude toward Greek organization. That was an R equals 0.64. There's no negative sign here, so this implies a positive correlation, and they also stated that a few words before. So we're seeing moderately strong, so that's 0.64. That's not very, very strong. It's not the 0.8 that we saw a few slides ago, but it's still pretty strong, and it's positive. So they report that, and then they report the p-value. So the p, as you saw in the chapter, has to do with the statistical significance. So for something to be statistically significant, generally we expect to see a or p-value being less than 0.05. And so we can do our calculations and get our correlation, but what's more important is whether that correlation is statistically significant or not. So very important to take a look at that in the text, just to have an appreciation or an understanding of what that is. But statistical significant is something that we need to report in our studies, because if it's not statistically significant, then that means that we're not really truly seeing an effect. So this would be how you would report your correlation. So you report the actual value, your correlation coefficient, and the statistical significance that you're seeing. And so they reported the relationship between self-concept clarity and attitude toward Greek organization. And then using their behavioral measure of interest, there was not significantly correlated with self-concept clarity. So they provide another example here, or two examples of non-significant effects. So the behavioral measure of interest and the self-concept clarity had a correlation of 0.04, so really close to zero, so tiny, but also not statistically significant. So if we look here, that p-value is 0.37, which is greater than 0.05. So that is not statistically significant. And then likewise, the behavioral measure was not significantly correlated with one's attitude toward Greek organization. So again, this correlation is really tiny, but so tiny that it's not significant. So their p-value was 0.14, which is greater than 0.05. So that was not a statistically significant effect. So just an example here of how you would write your results up. Again, when you take your statistics class, you'll delve a lot more deeply into some of these statistics. So the goal here is for you to have just a conceptual understanding of how we use statistics in our correlational research. On the next slide, we'll see how you would, so here you're seeing how you would write it up in the results section, but on the next slide, we'll take a look at what that would look like in a table. Okay, so just as how we have these APA requirements about how we write our results up, how we structure our papers, we also have some requirements about how we present our data in tables. And so here is an example of how you would typically present your data. In this class, you won't be actually doing an experiment, so you won't have data to present in your lab. You're just proposing a research idea. So again, this is something that you won't need to do in this class, but it's good to have an appreciation of what correlational research, the report of correlational research will look like if you decide to pursue additional research opportunities or go to graduate school. These are things you'd be doing there. But just for the purposes of this class, this is a really simple table. It just has 3 variables, so it's pretty simple. And the results here are reflecting the results that we saw in the write-up. So in addition to presenting your research in the write-up, you also present your research, your findings rather, your statistics in a table that looks like this. And so here we see where they're listing the variables. So self-concept clarity, attitude toward Greek organization, and behavioral interest, where there are 3 variables. They report the means and standard deviations are in the parentheses here. And then they're showing you this matrix of the correlation between the variables. So how you would read this is you would go across. So I'm not able to do a pointer, unfortunately, here, but follow me, right? So you would go from self-concept clarity, you would go across. You wouldn't see a correlation between self-concept clarity and self-concept clarity, but you would look to see what the correlation is between self-concept clarity and attitude toward Greek organization. That's 0.64. And from the previous slide, that was significant, so you put an asterisk next to it and show at the bottom there's a notation to say that the p was less than 0.001. Then continue across, you see the correlation between self-concept clarity and behavioral interests. And then in the following line, you would look at attitude toward Greek organizations. You go across, you wouldn't see a correlation there between attitude toward Greek organization and attitude toward Greek organizations again. And we already saw what that correlation was in the first line between attitude toward Greek organization and self-concept. So we skip that first one. We also skip the second because that variable wouldn't be correlating to itself. And then in the third column, we see a 0.07. So that's showing you the relationship or the correlation between behavioral interest and attitude toward Greek organization, 0.07. And then in the bottom line, we have nothing else to report because we've already seen that the correlation between behavioral interest and self-concept clarity was reported in the first line. The correlation between behavioral interest and attitude toward Greek organization was reported in the second line, and then behavioral interest and behavioral interest would not correlate, so there's nothing there. So this is typically the structure that you would use to report your correlation. And I won't be testing you on this table for the exam. Again, this is just for conceptual understanding. So please, I will try to remember to bring this up in class in case it was confusing trying to figure out how to read this with no pointers or clickers or anything. So I'm happy to revisit this in class to help you to be more comfortable reading this table if you're still not very clear about that. But in terms of the exam, you don't have to worry about being able to read a table like this because okay, so last slide, just kind of wrapping up the example. So at the beginning of this chapter, we talked about the idea that correlational research helps us to determine the association between variables, between 2 variables, right? Two factors, 2 concepts, 2 things. And correlational research is not trying to explain why things are happening. It's just where we're trying to determine if there is an association between 2 things. Correlation does not mean that there's causation. It's just telling us that something is going on. These 2 factors are either positively associated or negatively associated or not associated at all. And so just to provide you with, to wrap this example up and provide you with an example of what kind of conclusions we draw using correlational research. From the study that was reported or that we kind of worked within this chapter looking at self-concept and Greek organizations, we can see some of the key findings from that study were that self-concept clarity was significantly and positively correlated with attitudes toward Greek organizations in college. So we see that as people's self-concept clarity increased, their interest or their attitudes rather toward Greek organizations also increased. So that was a positive correlation. The more self-concept clarity you had, the more positive attitudes you had toward Greek organizations. Another key finding was that the behavioral measure of signing up for Greek organization mailing list, which was their measure, was not significantly correlated with either scales. So the behavioral measure they used was people's mailing list, looking at people's mailing list, and they did not see a statistically significant relationship between that measure and any of the other two scales.